Picture this if you dare. It is 1916, and the great double mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue stands like a limestone fortress against the Manhattan sky, its French Renaissance towers piercing the air with an almost desperate elegance, as if the very stones themselves understand they are witnesses to a performance that cannot last, and inside those marble halls walks a young woman barely into her 20s. A woman who 4 years earlier had clung to life in a freezing lifeboat while her husband, one of the richest men who ever lived, drowned in the black Atlantic waters, and now she paces these gilded rooms knowing that every moment she remains here, every dinner she hosts in that cavernous ballroom where 400 of society's elite once waltzed, every morning she wakes in silk sheets purchased with Astor millions, brings her closer to an impossible choice between love and fortune, between her own desires and the cold arithmetic of inheritance law. And what dark truths would these walls whisper if they could speak? What would they reveal about the real price of American wealth, about the invisible servants who scrubbed these floors at dawn while the mistress slept, about the way money transforms human beings into performing puppets dancing on strings made of trust funds and legal stipulations, about how even a maritime disaster that shocked the world and made headlines for months could not protect a teenage bride from becoming just another piece of property in a vast Astor estate that valued buildings and bonds more than beating hearts. The story of Madeleine Astor is not merely the tale of a Titanic survivor or a scandal-touched socialite who married too young and too well, but rather it is a dark anatomy of Gilded Age America itself, a surgical examination of how the grandest mansions ever built in this nation were not monuments to achievement but prisons constructed from marble and money, how the glittering ballrooms and picture galleries concealed mechanisms of control more sophisticated than any medieval torture device, how the inheritance laws and social expectations of the era could transform a 19-year-old widow and mother into a captive of her own privilege, forced to choose between financial security and human connection, between the Fifth Avenue palazzo and the possibility of love, and how the very estates that were supposed to represent permanence and power were in truth as fragile and doomed as the unsinkable ship that took Jacob Astor IV to the bottom of the sea. But before we can understand the tragedy that unfolded in those mansions, before we can grasp how Madeleine became both the most envied and most pitied woman in America, we must go back to the beginning, to the moment when a beautiful 17-year-old girl from a respectable but not spectacularly wealthy Brooklyn family first caught the eye of a 47-year-old divorced millionaire whose fortune was so vast it defied comprehension, and how that meeting would set in motion a chain of events involving scandal, death, inheritance battles, abusive marriages, and ultimately a lonely death that left historians wondering whether her heart truly gave out or whether the weight of all those years of performing for society, of living in those magnificent prisons, had finally crushed something essential inside her. Madeleine Force was born on June 19, 1893, into a world of comfort but not extravagance, the daughter of William Hurlbut Force, a successful shipping businessman, and Catherine Arvilla Talmadge, and while the Forces moved in respectable circles and sent their daughter to the finest schools including Miss Ely's and Miss Spence's, they were not among the 400, not among those families who could trace their Manhattan lineage back generations, and young Madeleine grew up understanding that beauty and breeding alone would not guarantee her a place among society's true elite, that she would need to marry well if she hoped to ascend to the highest echelons of American aristocracy. She was by all accounts stunningly beautiful, with delicate features, enormous dark eyes, and a figure that drew admiration even in an era obsessed with feminine beauty, and when she was 17, during the summer of 1910, she was vacationing with her family in Bar Harbor, Maine, that rocky paradise where America's richest families built their cottages, those sprawling estates that mocked the very word with their 50 rooms and ocean views and armies of servants, and it was there, amid the pine-scented air and the glittering waters of Frenchman Bay, that she was introduced to Colonel Jacob Astor IV, recently divorced from his first wife Ava Willing Astor in a scandal that had captivated newspaper readers across the nation. Jacob Astor IV was not merely wealthy, he existed in a financial stratosphere that made even other millionaires seem poor by comparison, his fortune estimated at between $87 and $150 million depending on the accounting, the equivalent of more than $2 billion in today's currency, derived from Manhattan real estate holdings so extensive they constituted a private empire. From the St. Regis Hotel he had built, from investments and properties stretching across the nation, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never in his life heard the word "no" mean anything other than a temporary inconvenience. He was an inventor, an author of science fiction novels, a lieutenant colonel from the Spanish-American War, a man of wide-ranging interests and considerable intelligence, but he was also 47 years old, nearly 3 decades Madeleine's senior, and his divorce from Ava, who had finally tired of his philandering and left him, had been front-page news, complete with all the sordid details of his affairs with other women, and now here he was in Bar Harbor, drawn like a moth to the flame of Madeleine Force's youth and beauty. What happened next would be debated in drawing rooms and gossiped about in servants' quarters for years. Did Madeleine pursue the colonel, dazzled by his wealth and status, or did he pursue her, enchanted by her innocence and beauty, seeking to replace the sophisticated, sharp-tongued Ava with a more pliable, adoring young bride? The truth, as always, was likely more complex, involving genuine attraction alongside the brutal calculations of class and money that governed every interaction in that rarefied world, and by the summer of 1911, barely a year after they met, Colonel Astor and Madeleine Force were engaged, and the newspapers exploded with scandal. The age gap alone would have been enough to fuel gossip, 30 years between them, she barely out of girlhood, he old enough to be her father, but there was more. Astor's recent divorce, the whispers that he had begun courting Madeleine before his marriage to Ava was officially dissolved, the sense that this was not a love match but something darker, a transaction where a young woman's beauty was being exchanged for access to one of the greatest fortunes in America, and the press coverage was merciless, cartoonists drawing grotesque caricatures of the aging colonel and his child bride, society matrons skiing about poor judgment and inappropriate behavior, and through it all Madeleine and her family maintained that this was a genuine romance, that she loved him and he loved her, that age meant nothing when 2 hearts beat as one, but how much of that was performance, how much was self-deception, and how much was the simple recognition that a girl from Brooklyn had been offered a chance to become one of the richest women in the world and would be a fool to refuse? On September 9, 1911, they were married in the ballroom of Beechwood, the Astor Mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, that sprawling estate at 580 Bellevue Avenue that had once belonged to Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor, the woman who had literally defined New York society for a generation, and the wedding was deliberately kept small and private, just family and a few close friends, because the couple knew that anything grander would be ripped apart by the press, and after the ceremony they fled, escaping on an extended honeymoon that took them to Europe and Egypt, trying to outrun the scandal and give society time to forget or at least forgive. But society had long memories, and when the newlyweds returned to America in the spring of 1912, they found themselves still largely ostracized. Invitations that should have flooded in for someone of Astor's wealth and status were notably absent, and Madeleine, now 18 years old and 5 months pregnant, found herself in a strange limbo, wealthy beyond measure but socially radioactive, living in a world that wanted her money but not her company, and it was in this context that the colonel decided they would return home aboard the newest, most luxurious ocean liner ever built, the RMS Titanic, a floating palace where they could travel in the kind of splendor befitting their station, where Madeleine would be treated like the queen she was supposed to be. They boarded at Cherbourg on April 10, 1912, occupying the finest first-class accommodations, traveling with Colonel Astor's valet Victor Robbins, Madeleine's maid Rosalie Bidois, her nurse Caroline Endres, and even their Airedale Terrier Kitty, and for a few days the voyage was everything promised. A floating exhibition of Gilded Age excess where the wealthiest passengers in the world dined on multi-course meals served on fine china, where an orchestra played in the palm court, where the grand staircase descended in a cascade of carved oak and wrought iron that seemed to symbolize civilization's ultimate triumph over the chaos of nature, and Madeleine, despite her pregnancy, enjoyed the attention and luxury, perhaps thinking that when they arrived in New York the worst of the scandal would have passed, that she could finally take her place as Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV and claim the social status her marriage had purchased. Then came the night of April 14, 1912, and with it the end of everything. Not just the end of the Titanic, but the end of the life Madeleine had imagined for herself, the end of an entire era's confidence in progress and technology and the invulnerability of wealth. The ship struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m., a glancing blow that most passengers barely noticed, and in those first confused minutes as the crew tried to assess the damage, Colonel Astor went to investigate, returning to their stateroom to tell Madeleine they needed to dress warmly and go on deck, that this was likely just a precaution but they should take it seriously, and still neither of them believed that anything truly catastrophic could happen to this ship, this marvel of engineering that everyone said was practically unsinkable. As the reality of the disaster became clear, as the deck began to tilt and the lifeboats were prepared and the realization spread that there were not nearly enough boats for all the passengers, Colonel Astor transformed from wealthy gentleman to protective husband, staying by Madeleine's side as they waited their turn, wrapping her in warm clothing, shielding her from the growing panic. And when Lifeboat 4 was finally lowered to the promenade deck and the call went out for women and children, he helped his pregnant 18-year-old wife into the boat, along with her maid and nurse, and then he asked the officer in charge, Second Officer Lightoller, if he could accompany his wife given her delicate condition, and Lightoller refused. The protocol was women and children first, no exceptions, and what went through Astor's mind in that moment as he looked at Madeleine, 5 months pregnant with his child, terrified and shivering in the lifeboat, knowing he was seeing her for the last time, can only be imagined. According to witnesses, his last words to her were gentle reassurances, "The sea is calm. You'll be all right. You're in good hands. I'll see you in the morning." Lies told in love, attempts to comfort her even as he must have known the mathematics of the disaster, must have calculated that with 1,600 people still aboard and lifeboats for only half that number, his chances of survival were slim, and then the boat was lowered away and Madeleine was rowed into the darkness, looking back at the brilliantly lit ship where her husband stood on the deck, and she never saw him alive again. What happened to Colonel Astor in those final hours remained somewhat mysterious, though his body was later recovered by the cable ship Mackay Bennett on April 22, identified by the initials sewn into his jacket, and the description of the body, crushed ribs, covered in soot, face swollen, led to speculation that he had been killed by the ship's first funnel as it collapsed during the final plunge, though this was never confirmed, and what is certain is that John Jacob Astor IV, 47 years old, one of the richest men in the world, inventor and author and heir to a fortune built on New York real estate, died in the freezing Atlantic waters while his teenage bride was rowed to safety, and the sheer gothic drama of it, the age gap, the scandal, the pregnancy, the disaster, transformed Madeleine from social pariah to tragic heroine almost overnight. She was rescued by the RMS Carpathia along with the other survivors, and one crew member would later say he had never seen a sadder face or one more beautiful than Madeleine Astor's as she was helped aboard, still wearing the heavy coat her husband had wrapped around her hours earlier, and when the Carpathia docked in New York on April 18, Madeleine was rushed to the Astor Mansion at 845th Avenue, the same mansion she would now inherit use of according to the terms of her husband's will. That massive double structure designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the French Renaissance style, all limestone and towers and mansard roofs, occupying the northeast corner of 65th Street and 5th Avenue, a palace that seemed to mock her grief with its opulence. The mansion was in truth two connected houses, numbers 840 and 841, designed to appear as a single unified structure, and it had been built between 1893 and 1896 for Caroline Schermerhorn Astor and her son John Jacob Astor IV, so that the aging Mrs. Astor could live next door to her son and maintain her position as society's arbiter even as age diminished her powers, and the architecture was deliberately theatrical, meant to evoke the chateaux of the Loire Valley, with Hunt lavishing particular attention on the entertaining spaces, the enormous ballroom where Caroline Astor had once held her legendary annual ball for the 400, the picture gallery hung with old masters, the drawing rooms with their gilded ceilings and silk wall coverings and furnishings imported from Europe at staggering cost, and the dining rooms paneled in dark oak with decorative ceilings so elaborate they required craftsmen to be brought from abroad specifically for the work. But what visitors never saw, what the newspaper illustrations never depicted, was everything below stairs, the vast machinery of servants required to make this palace function, to maintain the illusion that life here was effortless and refined. There were more than 40 servants working in shifts around the clock, housemaids who rose at 5 in the morning to lay fires and scrub floors before the family woke, laundresses who spent 12-hour days in basement rooms clouded with steam from the washing coppers, kitchen staff who prepared meals for both the family and the servants themselves, footmen who stood at attention for hours during dinners, valets and ladies' maids who dressed and undressed their employers like children, and every single one of them was expected to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to maintain the fiction that the Astors lived in a world where clothes cleaned themselves and meals appeared by magic and fires burned without anyone having to lay kindling or carry coal. Madeleine Astor, at 19 years old, newly widowed and pregnant, became the mistress of this establishment, and she must have felt the weight of it, must have walked those gilded corridors hearing the whispers of servants who had known her husband's first wife, who remembered when Ava Willing Astor had been the lady of the house and Madeleine was just the scandal everyone was gossiping about, and now here she was, elevated by tragedy into a position she had barely had time to grow into, carrying the heir to the Astor fortune in her womb, already one of the most famous women in America because of how spectacularly her husband had died. On August 14, 1912, she gave birth to a son at the Fifth Avenue mansion, and she named him John Jacob Astor VI, called Jakey, and with his birth the full implications of her husband's will became devastatingly clear. Colonel Astor had left the bulk of his fortune, some $69 million, to his older son Vincent from his first marriage, now a young man of 20 who inherited not just money but properties including the vast Ferncliff estate in Rhinebeck, New York, and the yacht Noma, instantly becoming one of the richest young men in the world, and Vincent's feelings toward his stepmother, barely older than himself, were complicated at best, hostile at worst, because he had loved his mother Ava and seen her humiliated by his father's affair with and marriage to Madeleine. And now this woman who had caused his mother such pain was living in the family mansion, was his father's widow, was the mother of his half-brother who might someday challenge Vincent's position as the Astor heir. To Madeleine, Colonel Astor had left what seemed like a generous bequest, an outright payment of $100,000, the income from a $5 million trust fund that would provide her with approximately $250,000 annually, and most importantly, the use of the mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue and the family's other properties including Beechwood and Newport, but there was a condition, a clause that would dominate the rest of Madeleine's life and transform her inheritance from a blessing into a gilded cage. If she remarried, she would instantly forfeit the trust fund income, would lose the use of all the Astor properties, would in effect lose everything except the initial $100,000 payment and a one-time settlement of $500,000, and this clause was not unusual for the time. In fact it was standard practice among wealthy families, a way of ensuring that the family fortune stayed within the family bloodline and did not pass to some future husband who might be a fortune hunter or wastrel, but in practice it meant that Madeleine, at 19, was being told that she could either remain single for the rest of her life and enjoy the income and properties that came with being a wealthy widow, or she could choose love and companionship at the cost of losing millions of dollars and the social status that came with those Fifth Avenue addresses. For 4 years, Madeleine played the part she had been assigned, the devoted young widow, the mother of little Jakey, the keeper of her husband's memory, and she lived in that enormous mansion on Fifth Avenue, wandering those endless rooms that had been designed for entertaining on a scale she never quite achieved because society still whispered about the age gap and the scandal even as they pitted her for her dramatic widowhood, and she summered at Bar Harbor, leasing the estate called La Selva, a cottage built in 1902 that had been designed for leisurely summers by the sea, with its weathered shingles and sprawling porches and views of Frenchman Bay, and later she stayed at Islescote House on George Vanderbilt's estate on the more secluded south side of Bar Harbor, and she wintered occasionally in Palm Beach, where the wealthy escaped New York's cold months, and everywhere she went she was attended by servants, by maids and nurses and chauffeurs, and on paper it was a life of extraordinary privilege and luxury, but it was also profoundly lonely, because she was too young to be a widow, too notorious to be fully accepted in society, too constrained by the terms of her inheritance to be truly free, and the mansion itself, for all its grandeur, was a constant reminder of everything she had lost and everything she could never have. The architecture of the place seemed almost deliberately designed to reinforce hierarchy and isolation. The family's quarters were spacious and light-filled, with high ceilings and enormous windows that flooded the rooms with daylight, while the servants' quarters in the attic and basement were cramped and dark. accessed by back staircases that ensured the staff could move through the house without being seen by the family, and the systems of bells and speaking tubes that connected the floors created a strange disembodied communication where servants were summoned by ringing bells and answered through tubes, their voices floating up from the basement kitchens to the drawing rooms above, and the amount of labor required to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury was staggering. The marble floors had to be scrubbed by hand, the hundreds of windows had to be cleaned, the silver had to be polished, the linens had to be washed and pressed, the coal had to be carried up from the cellar to feed the fireplaces, and all of this had to be done silently, invisibly, because the whole point of having servants was that the people who lived upstairs should never have to think about the mechanics of their comfort, should be able to wake up in the morning and find their clothes laid out and their fires lit and their breakfast waiting without ever seeing the army of workers who made it all possible. Madeleine understood intellectually that she was wealthy and privileged, but did she understand the human cost of maintaining these estates? Did she ever walk into the basement kitchens and see the exhausted faces of the scullery maids who worked 16-hour days for wages that barely allowed them to survive? Did she know the names of all the people who made her life possible, and if she did know, did she care? Or was she too consumed with her own performance, her own captivity within the terms of inheritance that required her to remain alone if she wanted to keep living like this? The answer came in 1916, when Madeleine was 23 years old and had been a widow for 4 years, and she fell in love with William Carl Dick, a childhood friend from Brooklyn, a banker and heir to a sugar-refining fortune who was wealthy by any normal standard but not Astor rich, and she faced the choice that had been hanging over her since her husband drowned: money or love, the Fifth Avenue mansion or marriage, the quarterly payments from the trust fund or the possibility of building a real life with someone who wanted her for herself and not just for the glamour of the Astor name. On June 22, 1916, Madeleine Astor married William Dick in a private ceremony, and in that instant she forfeited the trust fund income, $250,000 a year in 1916 dollars, the equivalent of more than $6 million annually in today's money, and lost the use of the Fifth Avenue mansion and Beechwood and all the other Astor properties. And control of these estates reverted to Vincent Astor, who now had complete dominion over his late father's real estate empire, and the press coverage of Madeleine's remarriage was a strange mix of admiration for her choosing love over money and criticism that she was abandoning her son's rightful place in Astor society, and Vincent himself was reportedly satisfied to see her go, to have her out of the house that he now considered his. And so at 23 Madeleine walked away from one of the greatest fortunes in America for the sake of marrying a man she loved. And it should have been a romantic ending, the kind of sacrifice that proves love conquers all, but instead it was the beginning of another chapter of tragedy. The marriage to William Dick lasted 17 years, and by all accounts it was not happy. They had 2 sons together, William Carl Dick Jr. and John Henry Dick II, but the relationship was strained. Possibly because Dick could never quite escape the shadow of his wife's legendary first husband, possibly because Madeleine struggled to adjust to being merely wealthy instead of spectacularly rich, possibly because they had never been as compatible as she had hoped, and by 1933 they were divorced, and Madeleine was 39 years old, twice widowed or divorced, the mother of 3 sons, and while she retained some wealth from the Dick marriage and still received payments for young Jakey's support, she was no longer the mistress of a Fifth Avenue palace, was no longer at the center of society's attention, was becoming a figure from the past, someone people remembered from the Titanic disaster 2 decades earlier. And what does a woman do when she has been that famous, that wealthy, that central to American mythology, and then finds herself sliding into relative obscurity, still comfortable but no longer commanding, still known but no longer crucial? The answer, in Madeleine's case, was to make one more catastrophic mistake. In November 1933, just months after her divorce from Dick was finalized, she married Enzo Firmont, an Italian boxer and actor who was 26 years old, 11 years her junior, and if the marriage to Colonel Astor had been scandalous because of the age gap with him being older, this marriage was scandalous because she was the older one, because Firmont was seen as a gigolo, because the whole arrangement reeked Of desperation, of a woman trying to recapture her youth by attaching herself to a younger man who was clearly using her for her money and connections, and the marriage was a disaster from the start, with reports of Fairmont being controlling and possibly abusive, of him running through her money, of epic fights and reconciliations and separations, and finally on June 11, 1938, Madeleine divorced Fairmont. And she was 44 years old, had been married 3 times, had survived the Titanic and scandals and financial upheavals, and she was alone again, living in Palm Beach, Florida, far from the Fifth Avenue mansion where she had once been mistress, far from the Beechwood estate where she had been married in that hopeful autumn of 1911, and her health was failing, her heart was literally giving out, whether from disease or from the accumulated strain of all those years of performing and suffering and trying to find a place in a world that had alternatively worshipped her and shunned her. And on March 27, 1940, Madeleine Force Astor Dick Fairmont died at her Palm Beach mansion at the age of 46, officially of heart disease, though there were whispers that it might have been an overdose of sleeping pills, a suicide, the final escape from a life that had promised everything and delivered mostly pain. Meanwhile, the physical estates that had defined her story were following their own trajectories of decline. The great mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue, that double palace designed by Richard Morris Hunt to be a monument to Astor permanence, was demolished around 1926, barely 30 years after completion, torn down not because it was architecturally unsound but because it had become economically impractical, because the sheer cost of maintaining such an establishment, the property taxes, the heating bills, the army of servants required to run it, had become unsustainable even for people as wealthy as the Astors, because the world had changed after World War I and the idea of families living in private palaces with 40 servants seemed increasingly absurd, and Vincent Astor sold the property to developers who razed the mansion and built in its place the Temple Emmanuel. And today if you go to 5th Avenue and 65th Street you will find no trace of the house where Madeleine gave birth to Jakey, where she spent those 4 years as a widow, where she made the decision to sacrifice millions for the chance at love, because it is all gone, demolished and forgotten except in photographs and floor plans that survive in archives, and the same fate eventually befell many of the other Astor properties, those estates that had seemed so permanent, so immune to the ordinary forces of change, but which in the end were just buildings, just stones and mortar that could be knocked down and carted away when they were no longer financially viable or socially acceptable. Beechwood in Newport survived longer, passing through various hands after Vincent's time, becoming at one point a tourist attraction where actors in period costume recreated the Gilded Age for visitors, and more recently being purchased by Larry Ellison, the Oracle founder, who renovated it as a private art museum. But the Beechwood that Madeleine knew, where she was married in the ballroom in 1911, is gone, transformed beyond recognition, and La Selva in Bar Harbor, where she summered in the years after the Titanic, still stands but has been sold and resold, lived in by people who have no connection to the Astor saga, and all these estates that once seemed so crucial, so defining, have become just real estate, just properties that change hands and get renovated and eventually have their histories forgotten by people who care only about location and square footage and views. But the story of Madeleine Astor and the mansions that both sheltered and imprisoned her reveals deeper truths about the nature of Gilded Age wealth and the dark machinery that sustained those glittering surfaces. These estates were never just homes, they were performances, stages where the wealthy acted out scripts of refinement and taste for each other's benefit, and the performances required audiences of servants who worked killing hours for subsistence wages, and the whole system rested on rigid hierarchies enforced through architecture itself, through the placement of servant staircases and the absence of windows in basement kitchens and the elaborate bell systems that turned human beings into disembodied voices answering summons from above, and at the center of it all were people like Madeleine, who had more money than they could ever spend but less freedom than they could bear, who were controlled by trust funds and inheritance clauses that turned marriage into a financial calculation, who lived in palaces but could not escape the prisons of expectation and obligation that came with every dollar. And when we look at the photographs of Madeleine Astor, the beautiful young bride standing next to the aging colonel, the tragic widow in mourning clothes, the society woman at Palm Beach parties in the 1930s with eyes that have seen too much, we should ask ourselves what we are really looking at, whether these are images of privilege and luxury or images of a particular kind of suffering that can only exist at the heights of wealth, the suffering that comes from being treated as a valuable object rather than a full human being, from being desired for your beauty or your connections or your potential to produce an heir rather than for who you actually are, from living in houses so vast and impersonal that you can wander them for hours and never feel at home. The fate of little Jakey, the Titanic baby born 4 months after his father's death, adds another layer to this tragedy. He grew up in the shadow of his famous father's death and his older half-brother Vincent's hostility, and while his father's will had set aside a $3 million trust fund for him, Vincent controlled the disbursement and made Jakey fight for every dollar, and when Vincent died childless in 1959, Jakey sued Vincent's widow Brooke Russell Astor for what he believed was his rightful share of the family fortune, arguing that Vincent had been mentally incompetent when he signed his last will due to alcoholism, and the lawsuit became a public spectacle that revealed just how dysfunctional the Astor family had become, how the wealth that was supposed to provide security and happiness had instead generated suspicion and resentment and endless legal battles, and Jakey, that little boy who had been born into such drama, whose existence had been front-page news, who should have had every advantage, spent much of his adult life fighting his own family for money, and when he died in 1992 at the age of 79, the Astor fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible had been largely dissipated through philanthropy and bad investments and the simple fact that maintaining the lifestyle of the super-rich costs more than even millions can sustain forever. And what of the servants, those invisible hands that made the Astor lifestyle possible, the people who lived and worked in those mansions but who left almost no historical record because no one thought their stories were worth preserving? Can we even begin to imagine what their lives were like, what it felt like to be one of the housemaids at 845th Avenue, rising at dawn in your tiny attic room, putting on your uniform and cap, descending the servants' stairs to begin the day's work of carrying coal and laying fires and scrubbing floors, knowing that your entire year's wages were less than what the family spent on a single dinner party, watching Mrs. Astor in her beautiful clothes and jewels and knowing that she had more dresses than you had days off, seeing the waste and extravagance up close while your own family back in Ireland or Italy struggled to eat, and did you feel grateful for the employment, for the steady wages however meager, or did you feel rage at the injustice of it, at the casual way the family treated objects worth more than you could earn in a lifetime, at the expectation that you should be honored to serve them, that your labor and your life were less valuable than theirs simply because they had been born into wealth and you had not? The historical record is largely silent on these questions because the servants rarely left written accounts, because literacy rates were low among domestic workers and because even those who could write had little time or reason to document their experiences, but we know from the few records that survive, from census data and employment records and the occasional diary or letter, that servant life in Gilded Age mansions was brutal, that injuries were common and medical care was minimal, that sexual harassment was endemic with female servants having no recourse against male family members or guests who assaulted them, that the hours were endless and the work was literally backbreaking, and that the turnover rate was high because people burned out or got sick or simply could not stand it anymore and quit, only to be replaced by a new wave of desperate immigrants or rural poor who had no better options. So when we tell the story of Madeleine Astor's Gilded Estates, when we describe the limestone facades and the ballrooms and the picture galleries, we must simultaneously tell the story of what those mansions cost in human terms, not just the millions of dollars spent on construction and furnishing, but the hours of labor extracted from people who had no choice, the exhaustion and pain and lost opportunities that went into making those stones shine, and we must acknowledge that the tragedy of Madeleine's life, and it was a tragedy, no question, to be widowed so young, to be constrained by inheritance laws, to make bad marriage choices, to die at 46 after a life that never quite recovered from that April night in 1912, does not erase the larger tragedy of a system that created such massive inequality, that allowed some people to live in 50-room palaces while others scrubbed their floors for pennies, that treated servants as extensions of the architecture rather than as human beings with their own dreams and needs and rights. The demolition of the Fifth Avenue mansion in 1926, less than 15 years after Madeleine lost it through her remarriage, is almost perfect in its symbolism. The great house stood for barely a generation, 30 years from completion to destruction, a monument to permanence that turned out to be as temporary as everything else. And when the wrecking crews arrived and began tearing down Hunt's elaborate Renaissance facade, when they shattered the carved limestone and ripped out the gilded interiors and carted it all away as rubble, they were not just destroying a building, they were demolishing a worldview, the late Victorian certainty that wealth and position were permanent and natural, that the class system was ordained by God or nature, that those who had would always have and those who served would always serve, and the fact that it all came down so easily, that the mansion could be erased in a matter of months, leaving not even a foundation stone in place, should have been a lesson about the fragility of the entire Gilded Age project, about how the seemingly eternal is always more temporary than we imagine. Madeleine's story intersects with the broader history of how America processes its relationship with wealth and power, with how we simultaneously worship and critique our millionaires and billionaires, and the way her story was told in the press reveals our collective ambivalence. When she married Colonel Astor she was a gold digger, when she survived the Titanic she was a tragic heroine. When she remarried and lost the mansion she was either romantic or foolish depending on who was telling the story. When she married Fairmont she was pathetic, and when she died the obituaries were sympathetic but also suggested that she had somehow wasted her opportunities, that a woman who had been married to one of the richest men in America should have done more with her life, should have been more significant. As if surviving a maritime disaster and raising 3 sons and navigating the incredibly complex terrain of Gilded Age society as a scandal-touched young widow wasn't enough, as if her value could only be measured by what she contributed to public life or culture or charity rather than simply by the fact that she was a human being who lived and suffered and tried to find happiness and died too young. The estates themselves, both the surviving ones and the demolished ones, have become symbols in American culture, visual shorthand for old money and establishment and traditional wealth, and you can see their influence everywhere, in the way films and television shows depict rich families, in the architecture of country clubs and expensive hotels, in the layout of gated communities where the wealthy try to recreate some version of Gilded Age splendor, but what these modern recreations miss, what they cannot capture, is the darkness at the heart of those original estates, the way they were built on exploitation and maintained through systems of control, the way they imprisoned their inhabitants even as they glorified them, the way they represented not human achievement but human vanity and cruelty, the impulse to build monuments to yourself regardless of the cost to others, to live in ways that declared your superiority over the mass of humanity, to use architecture itself as a weapon in the war of class against class. Today, more than a century after the Titanic sank and took Jacob Astor IV with it, more than 80 years after Madeleine died in Palm Beach with a heart that could not sustain one more beat, we can look at what remains and what has been lost and try to draw lessons from the rubble, that wealth does not guarantee happiness or even security, that the grandest mansions can become prisons, that inheritance laws designed to protect family fortunes can destroy the lives of the people they were supposed to benefit, that the performance of refinement and taste required by Gilded Age society was exhausting and ultimately hollow, that the servants who made it all possible were human beings whose labor and suffering deserves to be remembered and honored, that no amount of money can protect you from tragedy or disaster or the simple human need for love and connection, that buildings and estates that seem permanent will eventually fall to the wrecking ball or the changing tides of history, and that the stories we tell about the past, about people like Madeleine Astor and the mansions they inhabited, reveal as much about our own values and fears and desires as they do about the historical reality. The tragic story of Madeleine Astor's Gilded Estates is ultimately a story about the price of admission to a particular kind of American dream, about what it costs to live in palaces and wear diamonds and be photographed for society pages, and the price turns out to be higher than almost anyone can afford to pay. Not in money but in freedom and dignity and the ability to live as a full human being rather than as a symbol or a scandal or a beautiful object to be admired and controlled, and if we are honest with ourselves, if we look clearly at what those mansions represented and what they cost and why they were built and why they fell, we might begin to understand that the real tragedy was not that Madeleine lost her estates or that the Fifth Avenue mansion was demolished, but that such estates existed at all, that we built a society where some people lived like royalty while others served them in conditions close to servitude, where architecture itself became a tool of oppression. Where money bought not just comfort but the power to control other people's lives through inheritance clauses and trust funds, and the simple fact of owning the property where they lived, and that we still, in different forms, are living in the shadow of those Gilded Age principles, still building estates and accumulating wealth and using money to create barriers between ourselves and those we consider beneath us, still worshipping at the altar of old money even as we claim to believe in equality and democracy and the dignity of all human beings. Madeleine Astor died alone in her mansion in Palm Beach in 1940, her heart giving out just shy of her 47th birthday, and she was buried in Trinity Church Cemetery in Manhattan, in a mausoleum with her mother, and at her funeral the mourners must have remembered the beautiful 18-year-old bride, the pregnant widow on the Carpathia, the woman who gave up millions for love, and they must have wondered what her life might have been if Jacob Astor IV had not decided to return to America on the Titanic, if the ship had not hit the iceberg, if he had survived and she had lived out her days as Mrs. Astor in the Fifth Avenue mansion, and would that have been better or worse? Would she have been happier as a performing wife in a gilded cage, or was the messy freedom of her actual life, with its bad marriages and financial struggles and relative obscurity, somehow more valuable, more real, more human than the alternative? And there are no good answers to these questions, only the acknowledgement that Madeleine Astor's life, like the estates she briefly inhabited, was a performance in a larger American drama about wealth and class and power, and that her tragedy was both deeply personal, the loss of a husband, the constraints of inheritance, the failed marriages, the early death, and also emblematic of something larger and darker, the way that great wealth can be as much a curse as a blessing, the way that the most beautiful mansions can become the most inescapable prisons, the way that surviving disaster does not guarantee happiness or peace, and the way that no amount of limestone or marble or gilded ceilings can protect us from the fundamental vulnerability of being human, from the reality that we all, rich and poor alike, are mortal and temporary and fragile, and that the estates we build and the fortunes we accumulate will outlast us only briefly before they too crumble and are forgotten, leaving nothing behind but photographs and stories, and the haunting question of what it all meant, what any of it was for, whether the pursuit of wealth and status and architectural grandeur brought anyone involved. Neither the Astors nor the servants who maintained their estates, neither Madeleine nor the press who chronicled her scandals, neither the society matrons who judged her nor the millions of ordinary Americans who read about her in newspapers, any closer to genuine happiness or meaning or the feeling that their lives had been worthwhile. And the answer, if we are brave enough to face it, is almost certainly no, that the great game of Gilded Age society was ultimately hollow, that the mansions were monuments to vanity rather than achievement, that the fortunes that sustained them were built on exploitation and maintained through systems of control that diminished everyone involved, and that Madeleine Astor's tragedy was not that she was uniquely cursed or specially unfortunate, but that she was an ordinary human being with ordinary needs for love and connection and purpose, who happened to be caught up in a social and economic system that treated people as props in an elaborate performance, as pieces to be moved around the board according to rules established by dead men's wills and society's unforgiving expectations, and that her story, and the story of the estates she inhabited and lost, should serve as a warning to us today, a reminder that wealth without wisdom is dangerous, that grand architecture without human empathy is merely cruel, that inheritance laws that prioritize money over human flourishing are morally bankrupt, and that we must, if we hope to build a more just and humane society, learn to value people over property, dignity over diamonds, genuine freedom over gilded captivity, and the simple human right to live and love and choose our own paths over the deadening weight of tradition and expectation and the suffocating embrace of old money that promises everything and delivers, in the end, mostly grief and loss and the bitter knowledge that we traded our birthright as free human beings for a mess of pottage dressed up in limestone and called a mansion, and that the real tragedy of the Titanic was not just the 1,500 people who drowned in the Atlantic, but the way their deaths became spectacle and symbol, the way even disaster was processed through the machinery of class and wealth, the way Jacob Astor's death was front-page news while hundreds of third-class passengers drowned anonymously, and the way Madeleine's survival and widowhood became a story about money and inheritance rather than about grief and loss, because that is what we do, that is how we process tragedy, we turn it into narrative and gossip and legal proceedings and eventually into history, and somewhere in that process we lose sight of the actual human beings involved. Of Madeleine as a real person with feelings and fears and hopes rather than as a symbol of something, and of the servants and workers and ordinary people whose names we don't even know but whose labor built those estates and maintained them and who also deserve to be part of this story, whose tragedy was perhaps greater than Madeleine's because they never even got the temporary glory, never got to live in the mansion or wear the diamonds or be photographed for the society pages, they just worked and died and were forgotten. And when we tell the story of the Gilded Estates we must tell their story too. Must make visible what was meant to be invisible, must count the cost and exhaustion and injury and stolen time and lost opportunities, and must finally acknowledge that the entire edifice of Gilded Age wealth was a moral catastrophe, a failure of imagination and empathy, and that the demolition of those great mansions, however much we might mourn the loss of their architectural beauty, was in some sense a kind of justice, a return to a more human scale, a recognition that no one needs or deserves 50 rooms and 40 servants and a ballroom designed to accommodate 400 of society's elite, and that Madeleine Astor, in walking away from the Fifth Avenue mansion in 1916 to marry for love, in choosing human connection over quarterly trust fund payments, was in her small way rebelling against the entire system, was saying that she valued something more than money and property, and even though her subsequent marriages failed and her life ended in disappointment and possible despair, that initial choice, that moment of choosing love over luxury, stands as a kind of redemption, a brief glimpse of human freedom asserted against the crushing weight of Gilded Age expectation, and it is this image of Madeleine, not as the scandal-touched bride or the tragic widow or the woman who made bad choices, but as someone who at least once in her life chose her own happiness over what society and inheritance law demanded of her, that we should remember, that we should honor. Because in that choice she was more fully human than in all her years of performing the role of Mrs. Astor or the Titanic widow, and that perhaps is the lesson her story offers us, that the only escape from the prison of wealth and status is to walk away from it, to choose our own paths even when they lead away from mansions and trust funds, to value our freedom and our humanity over the deadening security of inherited money, and to recognize that the estates we inhabit, whether physical or metaphorical, whether made of limestone or constructed from expectations and obligations, are always at risk of becoming prisons if we forget that buildings are meant to serve human needs rather than the other way around, that wealth is a tool not a master, and that the only thing we truly own, the only thing we can take with us when we die, is the story of how we lived, of what we chose, of whether we spent our days performing for others or living for ourselves, and Madeleine Astor's story, with all its tragedy and loss and poor choices and early death, is ultimately a very human story, a story of someone trying to navigate impossible circumstances with limited tools and imperfect understanding, and if we judge her harshly for her mistakes we must also judge ourselves and the society that created the conditions that made her life so difficult, that turned marriage into a financial transaction and widowhood into a legal status and inheritance into a form of control. And we must ask ourselves whether we have truly moved beyond those Gilded Age principles or whether we are simply better at disguising them, whether our modern estates and gated communities and trust funds are really any different in substance from what the Astors built, or whether we are still, a century later, building prisons out of privilege and calling them palaces, still using money to control and constrain, still valuing property over people and profit over dignity. Still telling ourselves that vast inequality is natural or inevitable or even desirable, and still refusing to count the true cost of maintaining these structures, the cost in human suffering and lost potential and the simple moral injury of participating in a system that treats some people as inherently more valuable than others based solely on how much money they have or which family they were born into, and the tragic story of Madeleine Astor's Gilded Estates, with its scandals and disasters and demolished mansions and early death, should haunt us, should make us uncomfortable, should force us to confront the darkness that lies beneath the glamorous surface of wealth and privilege, and should ultimately inspire us to build something better, something more just, something more humane, a society where no one needs to choose between love and security, where no one is constrained by trust fund clauses or inheritance laws that treat them as property, where servants are treated with dignity and paid living wages, where architecture serves human flourishing rather than human vanity, where we value people for who they are rather than for what they own or how much they inherited, and where the lessons of the Titanic, that disaster does not discriminate, that wealth cannot buy safety, that we are all equally mortal and vulnerable, are actually learned and applied rather than forgotten as soon as the headlines fade and society returns to its usual obsessions with who married whom and who lives where and who has the biggest mansion and the most servants and the most expensive jewels, because in the end, none of it matters, none of it protects us from tragedy or guarantees happiness or makes our lives meaningful, and Madeleine Astor knew this, must have learned it on that frozen April night when her husband drowned and all his millions could not save him, must have felt it every day she lived in that vast Fifth Avenue mansion that was supposed to represent security but felt like exile, must have recognized it when she walked away from the Astor fortune to marry William Dick, and perhaps understood it most fully in her final years when she was alone and sick and poor by Astor standards but finally free from the weight of performance and expectation, finally able to simply be Madeleine, not Mrs. Astor or the Titanic widow or the scandal or the symbol, just a woman who had lived and loved and suffered and was running out of time, and when her heart finally stopped on that March day in 1940, when she drew her last breath in the Palm Beach mansion that was so much smaller and more modest than the estates of her youth, perhaps she found some peace in knowing that she had at least tried to live on her own terms, had at least attempted to be something more than what her inheritance and her husband's will and society's expectations demanded she be, and that is all any of us can do, rich or poor, famous or obscure, living in palaces or tenements. We can try to be fully human, to make our own choices, to love as best we can, to survive the disasters that come our way, and to recognize that the only wealth that matters is not found in trust funds or real estate but in the quality of our relationships, the depth of our compassion, the honesty of our choices, and the courage to walk away from what imprisons us even when it glitters like gold.